Good morning, and I welcome everyone to the 23rd meeting of the Local Government and Communities Committee. I'd like to once again thank the Broadcasting Office for their work helping organise this meeting, and I ask everyone to ensure their mobile phones are in silent. Item 1, we have consideration of whether to take agenda item 7 in private. Item 7 is consideration of our work programme. As we are meeting remotely, rather than asking whether everyone agrees, I will instead ask if anyone objects. If there is silence, I will assume you're content. Does anyone object? Thank you very much then. That is agreed. Item 7 will be taken in private. Agenda item 2 is consideration of the Draft Insolvency Act 1986 Scotland Amendment Regulations 2020. The committee will first take evidence in the instrument, and I welcome Kevin Stewart, Minister for Local Government, Housing and Planning, and James Hamilton, Solicitor, Housing and Local Government, Scottish Government. This instrument is laid under the affirmative procedure, which means that Parliament must approve it before the provisions can come into force. Following this evidence session, the committee will be invited at the next agenda item to consider the motion to approve the instrument. And remind everyone that Scottish Government officials can speak under this item, but not in the debate that follows. I invite the Minister to make a short opening statement.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thanks to the committee for giving me the opportunity to talk to you as part of your consideration of the draft regulations that will disapply registered social landlords from the new debt moratorium introduced by the UK Government's Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act 2020. This act was introduced as a consequence of the current pandemic to create a regulatory environment where companies are supported to survive the COVID-19 emergency and continue as a going concern. One of the mechanisms introduced by the Act was a new freestanding moratorium allowing a company in financial distress breathing space in which to explore its rescue and restructuring options free from creditor action. By introducing these regulations, we are ensuring that the application of the moratorium, which applies to all eligible companies and automatically applies to registered social landlords, which are companies in Scotland, does not conflict with the existing provisions in relation to insolvency, including a debt moratorium in the Housing Scotland Act 2010. In Scotland, there are only 10 RSLs that are companies to which the new moratorium introduced by the Act would apply. Therefore, the majority of RSLs would not be covered by this. The financial health, governance and performance of RSLs is thoroughly and systematically monitored by the independent Scottish housing regulator to ensure that they remain solvent and well governed. The existing moratorium provisions in the 2010 Housing Scotland Act have never been used. However, if the existing provisions were to be tested, they would provide sufficient time and space for an RSL to deal with financial difficulties in their business. Financial difficulties in the social housing sector are rare, and where they have arisen have been resolved satisfactorily within the sector with guidance, support and, where required, intervention of the Scottish housing regulator. The assurance the strong regulation of the sector brings is important because it ensures tenants remain in their homes and allows providers to continue to be able to access cheap borrowing to build more affordable housing. The regulations the committee are considering today will disapply these 10 RSLs that are companies from the new moratorium. It will remove the potential for conflict between the two insolvency regimes, which could lead to negative consequences for registered social landlords, their tenants and stakeholders. And the introduction of the regulations are welcomed by the Scottish Housing Regulator and UK Finance, collective voice for the banking and finance industry, as they will ensure a consistent approach is taken across the sector. All social housing tenants will continue to be protected by the existing strong provisions that are already in place to deal with financial difficulties in registered social landlords where they occur. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to speak to the committee.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Minister. Is there anybody got any questions? If not, Sarah, I believe you might wish to declare an interest at this stage.
I'd asked to declare an interest at the start of the meeting, convener, related to our next. I was giving myself the option to comment in this if I wanted to, but I'll declare an interest in my former employment working for SFHA.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. Agenda item 3 is formal consideration of motion S5M 22618, calling for the Local Government and Communities Committee to recommend approval of the Draft Insolvency Act 1986, Scotland Amendment Regulations 2020. I invite the Minister to move this motion and speak to it if he has anything further to add.
Nothing further to add, convener, and I move the motion.
Thank you very much. Any contributions from members? If so, please type R in the chat box. No contributions. The question therefore is that motion S5M 22618 in the name of the Minister for Local Government, Housing and Planning be approved. Are we all agreed? Okay. That is agreed. Thank you very much. The committee will report on this instrument in due course. I invite the committee to delegate authority to me as convener to approve a draft of the report for publication. I thank the Minister and his official for taking part in this meeting, and I will now suspend briefly to allow a witness changeover. At item 4, the committee will now take evidence from the Minister for Local Government, Housing and Planning on the Homeless Persons Unsuitable Accommodation Scotland Amendment Coronavirus Order 2020. Andy Whiteman has tabled a motion to annul this negative instrument, which will be taken at item 5. This item is an opportunity to take evidence from the Minister and officials before we move to that formal debate. I welcome once again Kevin Stewart, Minister for Local Government, Housing and Planning, and Graham Thompson, Temporary Accommodation and Programme Strategy Team Leader, Scottish Government. Minister, would you like to make any opening remarks before I ask members if they have any questions?
Thank you again, convener. And I'd like to outline the work which led to the laying of the Homeless Persons Unsuitable Accommodation Scotland Amendment Coronavirus Order 2020. Convener, the First Minister made it clear in the Chamber yesterday that the COVID-19 pandemic is far from over and that the virus still represents a significant threat to public health. As we know, there have been multiple impacts of the pandemic in relation to this SSI. Lockdown had a significant impact on the availability of both temporary and settled accommodation, where restrictions on local authorities and registered social landlords resulted in slowed turnover of void properties, resulting in lower numbers of allocations, which are still not back to normal levels. It was with this in mind that I agreed to extend the temporary coronavirus exemptions with the unsuitable accommodation order. And as you will see from COSLA's letter to the DPLR committee, the decision was reached with the full support of local authorities who have worked tirelessly over the last few months to keep people safe, supported, and to have somewhere warm to live during this public health crisis. Since we extended the order to all homeless households in May, we have worked in partnership with local authorities to develop guidance to support its implementation, and it was the intelligence that they provided alongside data collated by the housing regulator which told us that while voids are now being turned over and allocations to homeless households are being prioritised, the impact of the additional pressures on the system are still being felt. The result is that some councils will not be in a position to cease using emergency provision in hotels and B&Bs by October. And this includes local authorities that would not previously have been at risk of breaching the order, as they did not use B&B prior to the pandemic. Therefore, the decision to extend the temporary exemptions until 31st of January 2021 was made to take account of the enormous impact that the pandemic has had on the housing system and councils. The decision to include an extra exemption relating to supply was in direct response to a robust evidence base. And I want to make it absolutely clear to the committee that I'm committed to both reducing the numbers of people in temporary accommodation, which we are doing through rapid rehousing, and of course improving the quality of that temporary accommodation. And that's why I legislated to extend the unsuitable accommodation order back in May, creating legislation that both took account of the pandemic and made clear that when possible, we wouldn't just return to the homelessness system that we had previously. And while these temporary exemptions do mean that the extension to all homeless households will not come into full effect until January, it does mean that we will fulfil our commitment to outlaw the use of unsuitable accommodation in this parliamentary term, and still in advance of when we had originally planned to do so. Once again, thank you for your time, Convener.
Thank you very much. Minister, I invite questions from the members, and I know that Andy Whiteman wants to ask one. Andy?
Thanks very much, Convener. Yes, a couple of questions, Minister. First of all, what efforts have been made since the May order to ensure that there was sufficient suitable temporary accommodation over the past 6 months? And secondly, can you say a little bit more about the rationale for the new exemption, where a local authority is unable to place the household in suitable accommodation as a result of the impacts of coronavirus on temporary accommodation supply in the area, please? Thank you.
Minister?
Thank you, Convener. First of all, I have to say, in these unprecedented times, we have taken action with our local authority partners and with the third sector to ensure that people are safe and secure during the pandemic. And as the committee is well aware, we invested over £1.5 million to ensure that rough sleepers were off the streets and in hotel accommodation. We are now in a situation where, once again, local authorities and our third sector partners are doing what they can in terms of personal planning to move folks out of hotels and into other accommodation. Some of that and includes bed and breakfast accommodation at this moment, because as I pointed out in my initial speech, we are still in a situation where the void turnovers that would normally take place have been slower because obviously there are still restrictions in place. I would say, Convener, that the local authorities themselves are doing their utmost. I spoke with the working group that has been putting together the guidance around about unsuitable accommodation last week. That guidance to be agreed between Scottish Government and COSLA, I think, takes a logical approach, and I'm very grateful to local authorities, officials and, of course, councillors for their cooperation in all of this. They share my ambition to ensure that we move to a situation where folks find themselves homeless, that mainstream temporary accommodation should be what is in place. Beyond that, there have been discussions over the piece, not only around about what kind of accommodation can come into play. I am, as I say, very grateful for the efforts that have gone on. We are beginning to see the opening up again of allocations. Only this morning, reading the news that Fife are fully opening up their allocations. That is what we want to see, but that has to be done safely, Convener.
Thank you. Andy?
I'm still not clear why, for example, if Fife is opening up, why there should be a statutory exemption in place for circumstances where suitable accommodation is not available in the local area. I mean, that leaves it wide open to local authorities to make a judgment which in effect will potentially condemn homeless people in unsuitable accommodation for long periods of time.
Minister?
Convener, neither I or local authorities do that. And I have to point out to the committee that during the course of this pandemic, there have been a number of anomalies, and I think folk need to take account of some of these things. And let me give you a couple of examples where homelessness has taken place, and sometimes a lot of homelessness has taken place in areas which we wouldn't normally expect that to happen. So an example of that is during the course of lockdown, it came to our attention that a number of folks in the Pitlochry area were going to lose their accommodation, tied accommodation. I have to say that Perth and Kinross Council did exceptional work in ensuring that these folks had secure accommodation. With the best will in the world, there is not that level of mainstream temporary accommodation available in that area to house all of those folks that were affected. So Perth and Kinross, who over the piece have been trailblazers in terms of rapid rehousing, could not use their normal methods because of the amount of folk involved in that area. So in these cases, it is the case that we have to resort to what is available, which is sometimes hotel accommodation, bed and breakfast, which would be deemed to be unsuitable. Also, in circumstances that we find ourselves in, sometimes the only way to allow someone to self-isolate, particularly some of the most vulnerable people, is to use hotel and bed and breakfast accommodation. And if that option is closed, then that causes great difficulty. Beyond that, if I could give one other example, because the committee that will be aware that during the course of the pandemic, there was a prisoner release programme. Now, we did everything possible to ensure that people could leave prison into accommodation safely. But as I'm sure the committee will understand, some folks going back to households which all seemed fine to begin with did not work when they went back. So sometimes there is no alternative but to use this accommodation in these circumstances. And what we have to remember is that we are in unprecedented times. And I do not want to be in a position where we unfairly lock down the options that are available. And I do not want to punish local authorities for doing their level best for people. I think I go back to my point. We all have a shared ambition of ensuring the unsuitable accommodation order works. It was put in place earlier than we first envisaged. We are working with partners to try and get this right. However, we are in unprecedented times and options must be kept open at this moment.
Thank you. I've got Sarah and then Alexander.
Thank you, Convener. And can I just, again, for the record, draw attention to my register of interest. Good morning, Minister. Can I just ask you 3 questions? The first one was that you mentioned that you had given 1.5 million to local authorities in terms of additional funding. Would it be possible for us to get a breakdown on that, just to see how that money has been spent across the country in terms of categories and amounts? I think that would be helpful. Secondly, one of the issues that Shelter has raised with us in terms of concerns about this order is about the capacity to deliver social distancing and temporary accommodation. So I was wondering if you could make a comment on that in terms of what the guidelines are, and is it going to be possible for us to see those guidelines before they come into effect? I understand that in addition to the order, you'll prepare guidelines for local authorities so that you can assist them in making sure that they implement the order effectively. So it'd be good to get a sense of that. And the third question is whether you have a view on how long it is acceptable for people to be in temporary accommodation. Conscious that there's quite a range of people fall into temporary accommodation, particularly during the pandemic. As you've said, it can be completely from nowhere, unexpected, the example you gave in your comments. But I'm thinking of people who are women and families who are fleeing from domestic violence, people who've been made homeless that they weren't expecting to be made homeless because of family split-ups or whatever. So have you a view on how long it is acceptable for people to be in temporary accommodation, notwithstanding the fact that the pandemic has made everything much, much harder? Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Convener. First of all, in terms of the 1.5 million, if I gave the impression in my earlier answer that that all went to local authorities, that's not the case. It went to third sector partners, but I'm more than willing to write to the committee with a breakdown of where all of that money went, and beyond that, to highlight other resources that we have put into play from the £350 million fund that the government put in place. In terms of social distancing in hotel and temporary and bed and breakfast, Sarah Boyack will understand, I'm sure, that in some cases the only way to ensure that there is social distancing is to use hotel and bed and breakfast accommodation with the right measures in place to make sure that folks are getting all that they need. That cannot be done in shared situations. That cannot be done in previous hostel accommodation that was previously used by some local authorities. And we have to ensure that we get it right for everyone to ensure that we don't spread the virus. In terms of the guidance that has been jointly put together between the government and COSLA, as I say, we are finalising that as we speak, basically, and I've got no problem with sharing that with the committee. I think it's a good piece of work There has been a lot of cooperation. As said earlier, I spoke with officials who have been dealing with this last week, along with elected members from a number of councils, in order that we get this absolutely right, and to take account of where folks think that there may be difficulties. And I think we've done a good job in that, and I'm more than willing to share that guidance. In terms of the length of time, and particularly for women with families and pregnant women, the committee are aware that I already extended the unsuitable accommodation order to ensure that women with children and pregnant women were spending as little time as possible in unsuitable temporary accommodation. And I think that that was the right thing to do, and there is no exemptions around about that in this order, because we still have to do the right thing there. I am acutely aware of the difficulties that there are around about folks who have fled domestic violence during the course of lockdown. We have seen, I'm sure all of us, situations where tensions within families have grown, and that is why I have asked local authorities to look at ensuring that 80 to 90% of allocations, and when I say local authorities I also mean RSLs, that 80 to 90% of allocations at this moment are going to homeless people, those folks who have fled domestic violence, and other vulnerable people. We have got to get this absolutely right. I know that local government colleagues are doing their utmost. We don't agree on everything, but where we do agree is that we have a duty to ensure that we get it right for the most vulnerable people.
Thank you. Alexander?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. In your opening statement, you gave examples of councils and authorities that are working tirelessly, and you've just answered some of that in your last question. You talked about spikes that are happening across the country, and used the example of Perth and Kinross, where there was one in a rural setting. But can I ask the Minister, are we finding spikes across the urban settings at a greater extent, or is it in the rural settings where accommodation is of a smaller amount of opportunities for individuals to have that accommodation? And the rural aspect of things, is it having a knock-on effect, and a bigger knock-on effect in these rural communities?
Convener, I thank Mr Stewart for his question. And what we are seeing is different things in different places at this moment. And while, in the past, many of the main difficulties have been in urban settings, we are seeing things which are unusual happening in rural settings. And I gave that example in Pitlochry, and as a former Perth and Kinross councillor, Mr Stewart will know that would not be the norm in such a place. But it's not just Pitlochry. We've seen things happen elsewhere. Convener, I've spent a fair amount of time in the past few weeks and months talking to frontline staff who are in the housing options hubs to get a feel for what is going on right across the board. And even some of those folks themselves would say that they are seeing things which are not norm. And I think that is the reason why we have got to take account of what is going on during this pandemic period. I know that the folks on the front line are doing their level best, but what I do not want is a situation where we may be closing down their options. They want the best for people. There is absolutely no doubt about that. but we cannot close down their options at this moment. Again, I would reiterate, everybody has a shared ambition around about ensuring that unsuitable accommodation is not used. And that is why we have moved to change all of these regulations over the piece. As I said earlier, we brought this in early, and we have to take account of these unprecedented times. And I am more than happy if the committee wants to continue to monitor this, for you to write to me or for me to give you regular updates of what is going on. But I would be very, very wary if options were closed down at this moment.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Alexander. Okay, we'll move on to agenda item 5. The committee will now consider motion number S5M 22768 in the name of Andy Whiteman, asking the Local Government and Communities Committee excuse me, to recommend that the Homeless Persons Unsuitable Accommodation Scotland Amendment Coronavirus Order 2020 SSI 2020-268 be annulled. Andy Whiteman will first speak to and move the motion. There's then an opportunity for each member to contribute to the debate, and I propose to then take the Minister. Andy Whiteman will be invited to wind up and in closing to make clear whether he wishes to press or withdraw his motion. Invite Andy Whiteman to speak and move the motion. No, sorry, Andy.
Thank you very much, Convener, and I move motion 22768. My reasons for moving this motion to annul this order are to ensure that or to persuade the government to come forward with a better order. And my objections to this order are prompted by Shelter's comments on this, and focus really on two policy issues. My understanding is that the May order was intended to be interim and would not be continued beyond 30th of September. We've seen from recent statistics record numbers of people in temporary accommodation. And so there are two policy grounds on which I object to this. First is the question that the May order, the exemptions contained within that, were intended to be interim, were intended to be temporary, and work was to be undertaken during the first 6-month emergency period to ensure that those would no longer be required beyond that. But in this order, we find them being extended for another 4 months. The other policy objection is the additional exemptions that have been placed in this order. And the Minister, responded to my questions previously on why this is. I think the problem here, however, is that looking at the impact of coronavirus on temporary accommodation supply in an area is a very broad invitation to breach the spirit of the unsuitable accommodation order. And what it also does is that it places it makes people needing accommodation pay the price of that failure. And also, as Shelter argue, and I quote from their briefing, express reference to the impact of coronavirus on the supply of temporary homeless accommodation in secondary legislation will in practice make it very difficult for homeless applicants to assert a legal right to suitable temporary accommodation. End of quote. Convener, this is, it seems to me, fundamentally about resources. Homeless people shouldn't be paying the price of a failure to secure sufficient suitable temporary accommodation. The Minister said in one of his previous answers he didn't want to close down options, but the whole point of ending unsuitable temporary accommodation is precisely to close down options. That option should not be available. It is not a good option, and I would urge the Government to reconsider, amend this instrument and reintroduce it. Thank you, Convener.
Good. Sarah, you wish to come in?
Yeah, thanks very much, Convener. I agree with a lot of what Andy Whiteman has said there, and I think our challenge here is that at the heart of the issue, we just simply don't have enough appropriate housing across the country, and it's a fundamental shortage of both affordable housing and appropriate housing in terms of what people need, and the capacity for our local authorities to not just have the physical housing available, but the right support available for people. A range of people, we've mentioned people who are homeless. They might have pre-existing needs that need urgent attention and support going forward, not just the short term, but long-term proper support to enable them to move on in their lives, but also for people who are going through the trauma of having had to leave abusive relationships. And we know the difficulty that women with children particularly have in terms of getting accommodation. And then there's the hidden issue, which we're not even discussing, which is people who are just not able to move on generally because of the impact of the pandemic. So I think that there's some real challenges here for our councillor colleagues. I know people who are having to wait years to get access to social housing or the right move. And I welcome the work that's been done, but thinking about as we move into the winter months, the critical issue here is to get safe and dignified accommodation for people that meets their needs. And in thinking about this motion we have in front of us today, my challenge is I don't want to stop the work that councils are doing, even if it's not perfect. It's underfunded. They're dealing with a shortage of housing, and the work of organisations like Shelter and third sector organisations has been fantastic throughout the pandemic, and we will need them to support people through Christmas. And into next year until the pandemic's under control. My problem is that I don't think there's enough support has come to our local authorities over the last few months. I know from talking to people in my area that we've got 1,200 households in unsuitable accommodation as we stand at the moment. And the council are buying short-term let properties, taking them off the market, making them accessible to people for longer-term tenancies, which is great. But my own council's 10 million over budget for temporary accommodation because of COVID. So that's why I wanted to speak, because I want to say that I find it difficult to stop this statutory instrument going through because of the fundamental problems our councils are facing. And it would make me feel good to knock it back, but it wouldn't actually change things on the ground. So I want to ask the Minister what scope there is for improving the statutory instrument as has been suggested, what scope there is for giving more resources to councillors to let them get on with the challenge. I mean, I've met people on the streets who've been homeless, and the kind of problems they have, it's not that they don't appreciate being put up in short-term temporary accommodation like hotels, but for example, I spoke to people who were told they couldn't stay in the hotel during the day, and effectively they were back on the streets during the day, but were in the hotel at night. So there's a human cost to this pandemic. I think we all get that. So I think the issue is for the Minister, are there areas where you can improve this guidance that is going to be agreed between yourselves and local authorities? What extra resource can you put in place? And can you deal with some of the challenges that Shelter have put in their briefing to us today? Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'll bring in the Minister now, and then Andy can finish. Minister?
Thank you very much, Convener. The primary policy intention with this SSI is, as I've said, to take account of the ongoing impacts of this pandemic. And I think we all would agree, that where we thought we would be in May is somewhat different to where we are. We are still in a situation where this virus is on the go, and we have to take cognizance of that and take all necessary measures to ensure that we stop its spread and do our level best for people at the same time. Mr. Whiteman says that he wants to annul this and the government should come back with something better. I don't know if we could come back with something better. I do not know what that would be, but even if we did, we would not be able to come back with something and have that exemption in place in time. So that is a non-starter. I think that as we go on, we must continue to cooperate with local authorities and other partners. As I've said, we all share the same ambition. And I'm more than happy, as I've said earlier on, to continue to liaise with the committee about all that we're doing. We will share the draft guidance, as Ms Boyack has suggested, so that the committee knows exactly what we are doing. We will continue to communicate with the committee around about how we are tackling this with all partners. Can I say, in terms of affordable housing supply, which Ms Boyack has highlighted, we have delivered, this government has delivered over 90,000 affordable homes since we've come to power. We have, during the course of this Parliament, delivered more affordable housing. However, there has been a blip in that delivery as well because of the coronavirus pandemic, and we are now getting back to that delivery. But that in itself is not going to resolve the situation that we find ourselves in during the course of this pandemic period. This is unprecedented times, and I think we all need to take account of that. We all share that ambition. We just need a little longer to get there. But I would repeat that we are still in advance of where we said we would be in last year's programme for government. We brought the unsuitable accommodation orders forward earlier with those exemptions because we did not intend to lay them until March, but we brought them forward because of the situation that we find ourselves in. I think that we need to take cognizance of the situation that we find ourselves in, and I would ask members to take the logical view in this and to vote for this order, and you can be assured, Convener, that I will continue to communicate with the committee and provide you with the information that you want around about what we are doing as we move forward. We all want to get this right for people. We want to get this right for the most vulnerable people. And I'm quite sure that we can do so together as we emerge out of the pandemic period.
Thank you very much, Minister. I now invite Andy Whiteman to respond to the debate and press or withdraw the motion S5M 22768.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thanks to members and the Minister for their contribution. In relation to Sarah Boyack, I mean, I do absolutely understand and agree with the problems, with the challenges that local authorities are facing. I'm incredibly sympathetic with those challenges. I just don't see why those challenges should be the excuse for continuing a regime whereby homeless people could be put in unsuitable accommodation. That's not a problem or a challenge of local authorities' own making. On moving to the Minister's comments, I mean, on the substantive point about annulment of this instrument, he said that the government would not be able to come forward in time. Now, I disagree. I have two objections to this order, which I've set out. They could be removed, simple textual edit. This instrument could be brought back before the 30th of September. Obviously, that would breach the 28-day rule between laying and passing in Parliament. I accept that, but that wouldn't be the first time that government has breached that 28-day rule, and an explanatory letter would have to come to the committee, and I'm sure the committee would understand if the committee were to recommend to Parliament to annul this motion, it would be accepting the fact that it wanted it to come back with an amended instrument that would obviously be in place for the 30th of September and would reach the 28 days. But that shouldn't be a problem. I mean, fundamentally, the Minister said that we're still in a situation where this virus is on the go, and no one disputes that whatsoever. I think the problem I have is we have thousands of empty homes, we have thousands of second homes, we have thousands of short-term lets, and I don't see why, after months of considering the impact of COVID and having a much greater acute focus on the question of homelessness more generally, why homeless people are continuing to be allowed to be put into unsuitable temporary accommodation because of long-term failures in Scotland's overall housing system.
Andy, the Minister said he would like to intervene in a point you made.
I'm happy to take an intervention.
Thank you.
Thank you, Convener, and I thank Mr Whiteman for taking the intervention. As Mr Whiteman rightly points out, if we were to come back, we would be breaching the rules in terms of the amount of time available in laying an SSI. But beyond that, we would not have the opportunity to go back and consult with all of those folks who we have, vitally local authorities. So that is a non-starter. And I would ask Mr Whiteman if he has spoken to local authority, housing leads and others about this before he has asked for this annulment. We are getting people into empty homes, and that's in the social sector and the private sector. But that is slower than it normally would be because of the conditions that we find ourselves in. And again, with the best will in the world, we have to keep our options open at this moment, and we have to take cognizance of the problems that we're facing with this pandemic.
Okay. Andy?
Thank you, Minister, for that intervention. I mean, I accept there would be no time to do that consultation, but this is a negative instrument. I mean, the only opportunity Parliament has to debate policy intentions of negative instruments is, as we're doing today, through a motion to annul. And if we disagree with the instrument or elements of it, the only option therefore is to invite government to resubmit it. And other committees that I sat on have done that. So I absolutely accept this is not a perfect process. Convener, I don't think I was going to say much more in my winding up. Intervened, other than to say I press the motion.
Thank you very much. Okay. The question therefore is that motion S5M 22768 in the name of Andy Whiteman be agreed to. Are we all agreed? You may register any disagreement via digital channels. Could you maybe type in? Yep. Okay. Keith Brown, not agreed. Annie Wells, not agreed. Gail Ross, not agreed. Andy Whiteman, agreed. Alexander Stewart?
I have sent it.
Oh yes, thank you, Alexander. I've got it. Thank you. And Sarah. Alexander does not agree, and Sarah does not agree. Okay, and in that case, then let me make sure I get this perfect. In that case, the result is for the annulment is 1. Against is 6, including myself, and therefore the committee has agreed not to recommend to Parliament that the instrument be annulled and has made no recommendation to Parliament in respect of the instrument. The committee will report on this instrument in due course. I invite the committee to delegate authority to me as convener to approve a draft of the report for publication. Okay, thank you, and I thank the Minister and his official for taking part in this meeting. Agenda item 6 is the consideration of negative instruments 269 and 275 as listed on the agenda. I refer members to paper number 3, which contains further detail. The instruments are laid under the negative procedure, which means that the provisions will come into force unless the Parliament agrees to a motion to annul them. No motions to annul have been laid. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee considered Instrument 269 at its meetings on 15th September 2020 and determined that it did not need to draw the attention of the Parliament to the instrument on any grounds within its remit. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee considered Instrument 275 at its meeting on 15th September 2020 and determined that it did not need to draw the attention of the Parliament to the instrument on any grounds within its remit. Does anyone have any comments on the instruments? Okay. I invite the committee, therefore, to agree that it does not wish to make any recommendations in relation to these instruments. Does anyone object? Thank you. Therefore, no one objects, therefore that is agreed. And that concludes the public part of this meeting, and we will resume the meeting in private on Microsoft Teams. I propose we take a 5-minute comfort break. And please accept the clerk's meeting request for the private discussion, which will be sent shortly. You can exit the meeting by clicking on the red telephone icon. Thank you very much. And if the Minister is still there, thank you for his time. Thank you.